Pontius Pilate, a name forever linked with the events of the Passion of Christ and the crucifixion of Jesus. However, his life and career, his political actions and personal traits are more than just a footnote in Christian legend. Pontius Pilate was the Roman prefect of Judea in the 1st century AD, and his fate intertwined with that of Jesus Christ, even though Pilate may not have fully realized the significance of his actions. Judea at that time was under the control of the Roman Empire. It was not an independent state, but rather a Roman province subjected to strict Roman authority. The Jews, a people with a long history and deep religious traditions, were not willing to submit to foreign rule, which led to significant tension in the region. It was in this context that Pontius Pilate was appointed by the Roman emperor Tiberius as the prefect of Judea. In 26 AD, Pilate's task was to establish order and stability in a highly volatile and religiously sensitive province. But as we will see, his methods led to tragic events that would change the course of history. Tiberius, the Roman emperor, was known for his pragmatism and harshness in governance. One of his key policies was that officials should remain in their positions for long periods of time. He believed that frequent changes in governance led to corruption and instability. As a result, Pontius Pilate was appointed as the prefect of Judea at around 40 years old, and he would remain in this role for a full decade, a relatively long time for such a volatile region as Judea. We know little about Pilate's governance, as there are not many sources that describe his actions, and those that exist are often contradictory. Nonetheless, based on these fragments, several key characteristics of his rule can be highlighted. First and foremost, Pilate was a harsh and decisive ruler, often abusing his power. This was a common trait among Roman governors at the time, but in Pilate's case, his actions were especially controversial. According to historical accounts, Pontius Pilate was prone to violence, and his governance became emblematic of mass repression and executions. Testimonies from contemporaries describe him as a man of corruption, prone to insults, theft, and arbitrary executions. He did not hesitate to execute individuals without trial, making his rule especially harsh for the Jewish people, who were accustomed to their own traditions and religious laws. Furthermore, Pilate was known for his moral rigidity. For instance, when he set up statues of the Emperor Tiberius in Jerusalem, which sparked protests among the local population, Pilate did not hesitate to use force to suppress the rebellion. However, he also showed some flexibility and understanding in certain situations, particularly regarding Jewish religious practices. This gave him a somewhat ambiguous reputation, where, despite his authoritarian rule, he occasionally made efforts to appease local sensitivities. This complexity added layers to his character, making him difficult to fully understand or categorize. On the other hand, Pilate was not entirely loyal to Rome. He used his power for personal ambitions and often disregarded directives from Rome. This caused tension between him and the imperial authority. Such instability, coupled with his harshness, eventually led to his removal from office in 36 AD. Pontius Pilate's relationship with the Jewish population was extremely complicated. He was a foreign ruler, a Roman governor, who had no strong connection to local culture or religious traditions. In Judea, where religion played an overwhelmingly significant role, Pilate found himself in constant conflict with the local clergy and Pharisees. They rejected Roman rule and, moreover, resisted Roman laws and practices that threatened their faith. Pilate found himself at the heart of these religious conflicts. He was forced to balance Roman imperial expectations with the need to maintain some semblance of peace among the local population. However, as in many cases of authoritarian rule, his governance was more about suppression than dialogue, and his solutions were harsh. His decisions were often rigid, and he seemed to have no understanding of how to ease tensions between Rome and the Jewish people. His tendency to suppress any resistance led to increasing instability in Judea. Tensions rose, and local uprisings and rebellions became frequent. Against this backdrop, the fate of Jesus Christ became a pivotal moment that defined Pilate's legacy. In these moments, amid escalating political and religious pressures, Pilate found himself at a crossroads, forced to make a moral and political decision. Among all the historical sources, one of the most intriguing figures in the story of Pontius Pilate is his wife. She is mentioned only briefly in the Gospel of Luke, but her role in the events surrounding the trial and crucifixion of Jesus is none the less significant. Pilate's wife appears as an unexpected voice of compassion and warning, contrasting sharply with the relentless pressures of political and religious factions urging her husband to condemn Jesus. In the Gospel of Matthew, Pilate's wife sends a message to her husband during the trial, telling him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." This brief yet powerful statement reveals a remarkable tension in the story, the voice of reason and conscience, expressed through Pilate's wife, stands in opposition to the demands of the crowd and the political realities that Pilate faces. Her dream becomes an important narrative moment, suggesting that divine intervention, or at least a supernatural warning, was urging Pilate to avoid condemning Jesus. Despite the brevity of her mention in the gospel texts, her warning is a crucial moment of internal conflict for Pilate. She seems to be trying to sway her husband away from making a decision that could cost an innocent life. Her words, however, are quickly dismissed, overshadowed by the mounting pressure from the religious leaders and the public. The episode highlights the tragic irony that while Pilate himself struggles with the decision, his wife, from the sidelines, urges him to do what is right. The identity of Pilate's wife, however, is not known in the canonical Gospels, and her name is not mentioned there. This has led to later Christian traditions and apocryphal sources providing her with a name, Claudia Procula. Some early Christian writers, including the historian Eusebius, suggested that she eventually became a follower of Jesus, even going as far as claiming that she was converted to Christianity after witnessing the events surrounding Christ's crucifixion. According to apocryphal accounts and later Christian traditions, Claudia Procula was said to have preserved one of the most significant relics of Christianity, the burial shroud of Jesus, known as the Shroud of Turin. The legend suggests that she kept the burial cloth until it was eventually discovered and revered as a holy artifact. While there is no historical evidence to support this claim, it illustrates how her role in the story grew beyond what is mentioned in the New Testament. These traditions reflect an enduring fascination with the figure of Pilate's wife and her perceived connection to Christ. Although she was not directly involved in the political machinations of the trial, her story provides an interesting counterpoint to the otherwise grim narrative of Pilate's actions. As a woman caught in a patriarchal system, her influence is indirect yet significant. Her brief interjection into the events surrounding Jesus' trial adds an emotional and spiritual dimension to the otherwise politically driven decision of Pilate. Beyond her warning and her possible conversion to Christianity, there are also varying accounts of her life after the crucifixion. Some later legends suggest that Claudia Procula followed her own spiritual path, possibly even coming into contact with early Christian communities. However, much of this remains speculative, and the lack of clear historical documentation leaves her legacy as a figure shrouded in mystery. What is certain is that her presence in the narrative, although fleeting, draws attention to the complexity of Pilate's decision-making, and offers a glimpse of humanity and compassion in an otherwise cold political landscape. As we turn back to Pilate, the pressure on him to convict Jesus grew more intense with every passing moment. As the crowds gathered outside his palace, calling for the crucifixion of Jesus, Pilate found himself in a dire situation. The Roman governor was used to making difficult decisions, but this one was different. He was faced with the moral dilemma of condemning an innocent man to death, a decision that was complicated by the knowledge that Jesus posed no real threat to Roman rule. According to the Gospels, Pilate was reluctant to proceed with the execution, but he was trapped by the political realities of the moment. His primary goal as the prefect of Judea was to maintain peace and avoid any unrest in the region. He understood that the religious leaders and the crowd would not relent until they saw Jesus executed. This put Pilate in an unenviable position, caught between the demands of his Roman superiors and the need to keep the peace in a volatile province. He attempted several times to release Jesus, even offering to free him as part of a Passover custom of pardoning one prisoner. But when the crowd rejected this option and demanded Jesus' death, Pilate reluctantly acquiesced. The famous moment in which Pilate publicly washes his hands is a symbolic gesture of absolution. According to Matthew 27-24, Pilate washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." This dramatic act was meant to show that Pilate was not responsible for Jesus' death, placing the blame squarely on the shoulders of the Jewish authorities and the crowd. However, this gesture did little to absolve him in the eyes of history. His actions, or rather his inaction, have been the subject of much debate. Was Pilate truly an innocent man caught in a web of political and religious conflict, or was he merely another pawn in a larger game? The ambiguity surrounding Pilate's character is what has made him such a fascinating figure throughout history. His ultimate decision to allow the crucifixion of Jesus continues to haunt his legacy, as it symbolizes the failure to act decisively in the face of injustice. Pilate's personal struggle with his conscience, along with the influence of his wife's warning, highlights the complex nature of his character and the moral conflict that shaped his choices. After the crucifixion, Pilate's career took a sharp decline. According to various historical sources, including the works of the Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus, Pilate was eventually recalled to Rome after his brutal suppression of a group of Samaritans whom he had mistakenly thought were rebels. This act of violence led to his removal from office, marking the end of his decade-long rule in Judea. After his recall, Pilate's life became increasingly obscure. Various theories surround Pilate's fate after he was dismissed from his post. Some legends suggest that he was executed by the Emperor Caligula for his failure in Judea. Others claim that he committed suicide, unable to bear the guilt of his actions. There are even some Christian traditions that assert Pilate became a follower of Jesus, but these claims are far from certain. The truth about his life after his removal from office remains a mystery, leaving historians to speculate on the final chapter of a man whose actions helped shape the course of history. Following the tragic events of the crucifixion of Jesus, Pontius Pilate's career as the Roman prefect of Judea came to an abrupt and dramatic end. While his role in the trial and condemnation of Christ would forever mark his legacy, it was the aftermath of these events that became shrouded in mystery and myth. Pilate's fate after the crucifixion has been the subject of much speculation, with various accounts from ancient sources offering different, sometimes contradictory, versions of what happened to him. As mentioned in the previous section, Pilate's decision to execute Jesus was only one of several controversial actions during his time as governor of Judea. His harsh rule, which included the brutal suppression of uprisings and a notorious disregard for Jewish customs and sensitivities, eventually led to his downfall. The Roman historian Tacitus and the Jewish historian Josephus both note that Pilate's tenure was marked by several incidents that alienated both the Jewish population and his superiors in Rome. His handling of the Samaritans was a key factor in his removal from office. According to Josephus, Pilate's brutal treatment of the Samaritans, whom he had mistaken for rebels, sparked a wave of unrest that reached the imperial court in Rome. Pilate was summoned back to Rome to answer for his actions, and his reputation as a cruel and ineffective leader led to his dismissal. Tacitus also supports this account, stating that Pilate was removed from Judea due to his oppressive actions and his inability to manage the tensions in the province. It seems that, despite his 10-year reign, Pilate's ability to maintain peace had been exhausted by his own harsh methods and the mounting discontent in Judea. His recall to Rome marked the end of Pilate's direct influence in the region, but his legacy was far from over. The events surrounding Jesus Christ's crucifixion and the subsequent rumors about Pilate's role in those events would continue to haunt him, especially in the eyes of the early Christian communities. With Pilate removed from power, his life thereafter becomes a subject of intrigue, mystery, and myth. Ancient sources, including Eusebius and other early Christian writers, provide varying accounts of Pilate's fate, and over time, many legends and theories have emerged to explain what happened to him after his removal from Judea. One popular theory suggests that Pilate was executed by the Roman Emperor Caligula. According to this narrative, Pilate's perceived failure in managing Judea and his role in the crucifixion of Jesus were too much for the increasingly erratic and paranoid emperor to overlook. In the view of some ancient historians, Caligula saw Pilate's handling of Jesus as a serious affront to Roman authority, and thus ordered his execution. While this theory is widely believed, there is no concrete evidence to support it, and it remains one of the many speculative theories surrounding Pilate's fate. Another theory, which has gained traction over the centuries, suggests that Pilate took his own life in despair. According to the historian Eusebius, Pilate was so tormented by the guilt of his actions, particularly his involvement in the crucifixion of an innocent man, that he ultimately chose to commit suicide. Eusebius writes that Pilate fell into such great disgrace under the reign of Emperor Gaius, and that he became his own executioner. This account, though dramatic and tragic, fits within the context of Pilate's troubled career and the intense moral and political pressures he must have faced after condemning Jesus. Some versions of this story even suggest that after Pilate's death, his body was thrown into the Tiber River. However, the legend further states that the river became turbulent, and the body was eventually carried away by the waters, ending up in the Rhine River in modern-day Switzerland. This element of the story, while clearly mythical, adds an eerie, poetic quality to the tale of Pilate's final moments, further cementing his tragic and enigmatic status in history. Despite these theories of his death, some Christian traditions have embraced the idea that Pilate underwent a transformation in his later life. According to one account, Pilate converted to Christianity after his role in Jesus' death, and some sources even claim that he attempted to convince Emperor Caligula to convert as well. This version of Pilate's story presents him as a man who, haunted by his actions and the supernatural warnings he had received, including the disturbing dream of his wife, sought redemption through the Christian faith. The most widespread Christian tradition regarding Pilate comes from the apocryphal texts and legends that evolved in the centuries following the death of Christ. These sources suggest that Pilate's wife, Claudia Procula, was a follower of Christ, and that she eventually convinced her husband to embrace Christianity. Some traditions even claim that Pilate and his wife were both baptized by the apostles, though there is no definitive historical evidence to confirm this. The apocryphal text, the Acts of Pilate, provides an extended account of Pilate's role in the trial of Jesus, but it also portrays Pilate in a more sympathetic light. It emphasizes his internal struggle and the remorse he felt after condemning an innocent man. In some Christian traditions, Pilate is even depicted as a martyr, with some claiming that he was eventually executed for his newfound Christian faith. However, as with many aspects of Pilate's life, the details of his conversion and subsequent actions remain speculative at best. In some versions of the legend, Pilate's wife is said to have kept a relic known as the Shroud of Turin, the burial cloth of Jesus, which she preserved until it was discovered and became an object of veneration by early Christians. Though this tradition is not substantiated by historical records, it adds another layer of mystique to the story of Pilate's later life and his connection to the growing Christian movement. What is undeniable, however, is the lasting impact that Pontius Pilate has had on both history and religious thought. Pilate's name has become synonymous with moral ambiguity, and his actions continue to be the subject of philosophical and theological debate. His role in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, the condemnation of an innocent man to death, makes him one of history's most notorious figures. At the same time, Pilate's internal conflict and the symbolism of his actions, especially the famous moment when he washed his hands in front of the crowd, declaring himself innocent of Jesus' blood, raise profound questions about human responsibility, the nature of justice, and the difficulty of making ethical decisions in politically charged environments. Pilate remains a symbol of the human struggle between conscience and power, between personal guilt and the demands of authority. The fact that his fate, like his life, is shrouded in mystery only adds to his legacy. Whether he died by execution, suicide, or conversion to Christianity, Pilate's story continues to provoke reflection and inspire theological and historical inquiry. His name endures not just as a figure of historical interest, but as a symbol of the complexities of human nature and the profound consequences of the choices we make.